humanity looked at the spread of data to see that trooping quote-unquote good 7 to 27-year-olds to war quote-unquote evil had the same effect for millenia, violently adopting success only for a select few who managed to look and act a certain way. So they chose to move into higher expressions of adoption immediately. Parent, teacher, student decided to support every student succeeds instead of war, and the violent cycles transmuted into love without uproar. Parent, teacher, student stopped projecting war and began to forgive self for perpetuating violent cycles with hateful thoughts and actions towards self and others, as she decided to move from low to high expressions of adoption to abide and ensure every student succeeds. Parent, teacher, student began to develop the capacity to manage their feelings of fear, loss, grief, rejection, mastery and control, guilt and shame, intimacy, identity, dissolving the wild and deep desire to adopt animal, baby, culture, land, outer space, alien, war, to meet their needs. In lower expressions of adoption, we saw adoptees who dared to come out of the fog of adoption fairy tales lost the support of their adoptive families and communities, enduring scapegoating, hate, intolerance, violence, on par with the LGBTQ+ coming out of the closet, leading to self-harm and suicide. In lower expressions of adoption, we saw healthcare providers, teachers, lawyers dismiss, discard, gaslight, challenge the adoptee daring to come out of the fog of adoption fairy tales, from the pediatrician to the primary care practitioner, from the gynecologist to the adoption counselor. In lower expressions of adoption, we saw the adoptee mistaken and mistreated by parent, professional, president as asshole, addict, ADHD, ADD, bipolar, bitch, criminal, dumb, evil, failure, rude, ungrateful, unworthy of belonging, amounting to a subtle genocide and Holocaust. In lower expressions of adoption, we saw the adoptee mistaken and mistreated as a quote-unquote behavior problem in need of being kicked out of the class through home for redirection, remediation, punishment. In lower expressions of adoption, posts about adoption realities remain virtually untouched compared to posts about adoption fairy tales. In lower expressions of adoption, the adoptee coming out of the fog of adoption fairy tales appears abusive, neglectful, even narcissistic to the parent, peer, and professional. In lower expressions of adoption, parent and professionals whitewash, direct BIPOC adoptee to check the quote-unquote white box, pass off the adoptee to siblings, aunts, uncles to figure it out, and discourage honest conversations about adoption, ethnicity, race, culture, family of the adoptee. In lower expressions of adoption, discouraged from speaking about adoption, the adoptee learns to lie and gets judged as a liar by parent through professional. In lower expressions of adoption, the adoptee puts others before self, decides to give up their life and free will in order to serve and meet the needs of adoptive parents, choosing to stay in the fog of adoption fairy tales in order to belong to their adoptive families and communities. In lower expressions of adoption, Homeland Security looks like parents adopt war, and the adoptee agrees to serve in the military in exchange for citizenship in first world nations. In lower expressions of adoption, the majority of milieu in prison, military, police, rehab, mental health facilities, and special ed classrooms are literal and figurative adoptees and orphans. In higher expressions of adoption, parent, professional, president design with the end in mind, with an equitable, dignified, ever-evolving social contract that honors the special needs of the orphans and adoptees and the adoptor agrees to lifelong learning on how to meet the adoptee's needs. In higher expression of adoption, parent, professional, president see evil and bully as hurt and offer healing treatments instead of discarding with punishment and scapegoating. In higher expressions of adoption, parent, teacher, student sees their impulse to fight in war as their grief-struck by loss amygdala, possessed by grief, in need of self-care, not a force march, and swaps out the word fight of their daily talk in favor of a peaceful word to describe the effort. In higher expressions of adoption, parks and peaceful mementos replace military art on virtually every corner and car. In higher expressions of adoption, parent, teacher, student consume shows teaching them how to meet the needs of their students instead of the news, CSI, war stories, murder mysteries, award shows, Olympics, and sports. In higher expressions of adoption, parent, teacher, student apologized each time they stepped on a student's proverbial foot, not knowing what the fuck to do, leaving the student triggered and screaming, "Fuck you!" In higher expressions of adoption, parent, teacher, student swapped out talking shit on their mate, kids, friends, enemies, students, self, swapping in compassion, forgiveness, understanding for self and others, slowing down the pace of life, transmuting the racism into love. They stopped racing around to get things done. In higher expressions of adoption, parent, teacher, student spent the majority of each day tending to self instead of running around saving the world. In higher expressions of adoption, parent, teacher, student swapped out good and evil for more relevant, accurate, just descriptors because believing in good and evil sabotaged every student succeeds. In higher expressions of adoption, parent, teacher, student swapped out insultathons for differentiation. In higher expressions of adoption, parent, teacher, student developed the capacity to really love themselves, learning how to forgive self and apologize for lashing out their loss onto their students. And that knowledge about balancing unconditional love and power transmitted to their students. In high expressions of adoption, a two-party system of government was taken over by a system that adopted success for one and all, transmuting violent cycles into love, upon which everybody agreed. In high expressions of adoption, motherly, fatherly love dissolved sibling rivalry. In high expressions of adoption, acute chronic disease, health issues, mental illness, obesity, addiction dissolved into optimum health. In higher expression of adoption, military police was replaced with healing, teaching, home school. In higher expressions of adoption, parent, teacher, student learned how to be an emotional support dog for their adoptee instead of vice versa. In higher expressions of adoption, parent, teacher, student learned to take rejection with grace instead of war, seeking revenge, lashing out violently, flunking out of family, school, society, overdosing, suicide, and the adopted student followed suit. In high expressions of adoption, parent, teacher, student committed to learn more each season and year how to meet the needs of their ever-evolving adoptee and themselves, peacefully and joyfully. In high expressions of adoption, adoptive families integrated with maternal and paternal birth families of the adoptee, committed to adopt success for one and all, transmuting violent cycles into love. In higher expressions of adoption, the international orphan adopted by U.S. citizens and becoming a naturalized citizen was not excluded from presidential office because parent, teacher, student amended the U.S. Constitution, Article 2, Section 1, Clause 5, to be more equitable and just. In higher expressions of adoption, parent, teacher, student saw their impulse to disown their adoptee in order to teach a lesson as a sign to tag out, instead of re-injuring the adoptee's primal wounds systemically by orphaning them emotionally or physically to prove a point. In higher expressions of adoption, parent, teacher, student understood the hurt they felt at getting called out on the abuse and neglect by an adoptee as the guilt and shame at letting them down and not knowing what to do, instead of projecting on the adoptee, "That hurts, how dare you?" In higher expressions of adoption, parent, teacher, student placed high value on taking time to do their loss work, to heal childhood wounds from their families of origin through strangers, instead of sweeping it under the carpet, projecting it on the student, and racism, racing around to save the world. In higher expressions of adoption, unwanted pregnancies dissolved because men, women, non-binary, aliens stepped into their own sovereignty instead of fucking around to fit in and belong. In higher expressions of adoption, unwanted pregnancies dissolved because men, women, non-binary, aliens stepped into their sovereignty instead of succumbing to their grief struck by loss, amygdala, cycling, fight, flight, freeze, fuck, fawn, violence, to fit in and belong, to be accepted. In higher expressions of adoption, parent, teacher, student abandoned the fairy tale that adopted an animal, baby, teen, culture, land, outer space, alien, war, magically healed the primal wounds that caused them to want to adopt, as well as healing the primal wounds of the adoptee.